This is the Distinctly Detroit podcast, the only pod that explores why one wants to be in the D. I am your host, Fyodor Ship III, the director of the University of Michigan Detroit Center. Join me as I interview students, scholars, leaders, and innovators about living, working, and loving in Detroit. Today we probe the mind of an African-centered historian whose tours of Detroit have educated young and old about the African and African-American history in the city. He has been featured on C-SPAN, stateside, and has recently been appointed by Michigan Governor Whitmer to the state's Freedom Trail Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, Jamon Jordan.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for having me here today.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be here. So we want to get this rolling right off the bat. Can you please tell us about the Black Scroll Network?
So Black Scroll Network History and Tours is a company I founded in 2013. And what we were founded on was to really give people an up-close and personal experience with African-American history, especially Detroit's African-American history. So we lead tours, lectures, presentations dealing with any aspect of African-American history, but especially Detroit's African-American history. And so we take people to the historic sites so they can learn about the people, the places, and the events that are part of Detroit's Black history.
Oh, that's awesome. How did you get started doing this?
So for 20 years, I was a teacher inside of a classroom, and I taught social studies most of that time. About half of that time I taught middle school social studies, but I've taught every grade from K through 12. And when I first became a teacher in 1999, after leaving Kalamazoo, where I went to college at Western Michigan University, when I came back to the city of Detroit, when I was a teacher, what was missing was African-American history. So, Martin Luther King Jr., yes, of course you're gonna know about him, and Harriet Tubman maybe, and Frederick Douglass, and a couple of other notables. They were included in the curriculum, but most of the deep understanding of African-American history was missing. So I had to include it. I had to find a way to put it in because it wasn't in the books, it wasn't a part of the curriculum, so I just had to do it on my own. But then as we got better with that, I wasn't the only person, there were other people who were fighting to make sure that happened. So it began to be included in more of the schools that I worked at. Detroit's African-American history was missing. So people were learning about the Underground Railroad, and they were learning about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison on the East Coast. They weren't learning about the Detroit parts of the Underground Railroad. Detroit is a major part of that story. They were missing that part. They learned about the Civil Rights Movement. So they were learning about Montgomery, Alabama, and Selma, Mississippi, and of course that's an important part of history we ought to know. But Detroit has a major role in civil rights history. So the fight against housing segregation, the fight against school inequality, the major fights against police brutality and racism in the political administration of the city, that had been an ongoing fight for decades in the city of Detroit. That's part of the civil rights story, but it never gets told. So students are spouting off information that they've learned about Montgomery, Alabama, but they can't tell you what happened 2 blocks away from where they live, where there was a major civil rights fight. I had students who were living in the same neighborhood as Dr. Ocean Sweet's home, and they knew about Montgomery, but they didn't know about what happened with Dr. Ocean Sweet in 1925. So I thought that was a crime for me to continue teaching them about all these other places, and they live in Detroit and they don't know anything about this history in the city of Detroit. So I began taking them on field trips to these historic sites. Their parents would begin to join as chaperones. Many of them were learning this information for the first time. And other people wanted to join these student field trips, and you just can't do that. You can't bring strangers on tours with children. So I had to do something for them at a different time. So on the weekends or in the summers when I wasn't in the classroom, I would do this. And for a few years, I was doing both. I was a teacher in the classroom and doing this tour business when I wasn't in classroom. But since 2015, this is all I do.
Okay. How important is it to you to destroy and correct the myths and miseducation pertaining to Detroit's African-American history?
Well, that's a major part of what I do. Now, I don't go into history and teaching it with that as my goal, to destroy myths and destroy the false teachings about Detroit. I go in to teach the truth. And what that actually does, of course, the side effect of that is that it does destroy those myths. And people who never knew these things, people who say, man, Detroit was really messed up, and finally, there's something downtown. Finally, things are being built. Well, they never knew that there was this black business and entertainment district known as Paradise Valley, where there were 350 black-owned businesses in the 1920s. They don't know anything about that part of the history because it's missing. It's not in the textbooks. They've never heard it before. In their view, Detroit was great before black people showed up. They don't know that black people were a downtown business development engine prior to that it being destroyed by urban renewal policies. And so it's, for many people, both white and black, they're learning this information for the first time. And most of them, not all, but most of them are angry that they never learned this. They've lived their whole lives in the city of Detroit and they never were taught this. They never learned this information. So it does destroy a lot of these myths and false teachings about the city of Detroit, even though that's not why I go in it. I don't go looking for stories that will destroy, blow up people's minds. I go in to try to teach the truth about the city of Detroit and this history that we ought to have learned a long time ago, but we didn't. And when I do that, it ends up doing exactly that, destroying the myths about the city of Detroit.
Okay. So what are some of the things that people are generally surprised to learn on your tours?
Okay, so I kind of mentioned a few of them already, and one of them, of course, is that Detroit plays a major role in the Underground Railroad. So that people don't know that. A lot of Detroiters are beginning to know that, so it's becoming more known about in Detroit. But outside the city of Detroit, when they hear about the Underground Railroad, they think Harriet Tubman. They think Frederick Douglass. And so they're thinking about Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, Canada, maybe Massachusetts, and that East Coast wing of the Underground Railroad, or Ohio. Ohio has done a very good job of presenting itself as a major player in the Underground Railroad. But they do not think Detroit. And it's sad that they don't think that because Detroit sits on an international border with another country, which is why it's so important in the Underground Railroad, because people are fleeing the country because of fugitive slave laws. And the fugitive slave laws basically state that even if you make it to a free state, slave catchers and bounty hunters can take you back to a slave state, back to slavery. So what you need to do if you want to get outside of the boundaries of the fugitive slave laws, you got to leave the country. Well, Detroit sits at an international border with another country. And so Detroit becomes highly important in the Underground Railroad. A lot of people don't know that. Again, more Detroiters are beginning to know that. But people outside the city of Detroit, they do not know this story. So that's one. A second one is that Detroit itself had slavery. And so that's another one that people are shocked to learn. They tend to think, and we've been taught to think, that slavery is a Southern institution. And so Mississippi, of course, it had slavery. Alabama, yes. North, South Carolina, Virginia, of course they had slavery. But not Michigan. And some people don't know New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Delaware, Rhode Island, all of them had slavery. All of the 13 colonies had slavery. And Michigan, which doesn't start as one of the 13 colonies at that time, it's a French-controlled area. Well, the French are slave owners, so they're involved in slavery. Their major slave colonies are in the Caribbean, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue. And of course, we know Saint-Domingue is Haiti. But so when the wealthy French come here, they're well acquainted with slavery. They've been practicing the enslavement of Africans for over a century about this point when they arrive in 1701. So they bring enslaved Africans with them. So Detroit had slavery. And so that's another thing that blows the minds of a lot of people, that they don't think of Detroit as being a place that had slavery. So slavery and the Underground Railroad are two things. Of course, the Black Bottom and Paradise Valley period in the city of Detroit, where there's an African-American residential neighborhood, roughly by the time we get to the 1930s, the neighborhood known as Black Bottom, that Lower East Side neighborhood, is predominantly African-American by that time, until it's destroyed in the 1950s and 60s. And then Paradise Valley, this black business district, which really begins to develop around the 1920s until it's destroyed in the 1960s by the building of the I-375 and I-75 freeway. That urban renewal project destroys this black business district. People don't know that black people were building businesses, building institutions, building a community and it was destroyed. Not they just didn't know what they were doing. They were criminals. It was just a slum. That's the image that we've many times been taught, but that black people had a business district, an entertainment district, and a residential district that was not destroyed because of their fault, but because of policies by the federal, state, and city governments that destroyed these communities. So that's another one. And then I have to say one last one, and I already talked about civil rights. Okay, so again, civil rights being a part of Detroit's history is another part, but music history. When people think of Detroit music history, they think of Motown. Yeah. And that's it. Maybe they'll think about Aretha Franklin. So you got Aretha and Motown, and that kind of takes up the room when we talk about Detroit music. But Detroit is major in music way before Motown. I'm talking about black music. So they're major in ragtime, major in big band, swing jazz. In fact, many of the clubs in Paradise Valley, that's the kind of music that's being performed at those clubs. At the Club 606, at Raymond Sportree's Music Aquarium, at the Paradise Theater. The kind of music that's being performed there is big band, swing jazz. If you want to hear the pop music of the 1920s, 30s, and early 40s, that's big band. And where you're going to hear that at the most in the city of Detroit is in Paradise Valley. So big band, and then when we move to modern or bebop jazz in the 1940s and 50s and early 60s, Detroit is a major player in that music as well. The Bluebird Inn, the Flame Show Bar, the Apex Lounge, these different clubs in the city of Detroit are highlighting this next level of jazz music that is not quite as popular as big band, but Detroit is a major player. People like Wendell Harrison, people like even Miles Davis plays at the Bluebird. He's in the band at the Bluebird. Harold McKinney. These are these major bebop musicians. Donald Byrd, they're right here in the city of Detroit, and a lot of people don't know that Detroit had this other music history that precedes Motown in one sense, but in another sense, it opens the door for there to be a Motown. Many of those musicians who are playing at Motown, the Funk Brothers included, were jazz musicians. So they were jazz musicians playing at these other clubs before Motown came along and hired these skilled musicians. What other kind of skills would they have in the city of Detroit except jazz and blues? So they were already jazz and blues musicians because Motown kind of music hadn't existed yet. So the popular music prior to that is jazz and blues, and that's what those musicians were.
I remember reading books like Berry Gordy's autobiography and things like that, that once upon a time, Detroit Public Schools had great music programs.
That's right.
Great music teachers and things. And that's where a lot of these artists learned in public schools.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why Detroit was this center of music. It was iconic music coming out of the city of Detroit was because of Detroit Public Schools. And so even though the schools weren't integrated in the sense that you had schools that had, if Detroit was 50% black, there were many schools that were 80% white. So schools like Redford and Cody and Denby, and for a long time even Mumford, these schools didn't represent Detroit's racial population. They were majority white for a long period of their time. However, there were black people in those schools, even though it might have been 10% of African Americans. They are in this school with whites. And because the schools are still predominantly white, the resources are still there. Because Detroit Public Schools is really passing out resources unequally. And where the majority of the students are white, those schools get more resources. Where the schools are predominantly African American, they tended to get less resources. And so if there's 10% black students at Mumford, well, they're getting music teaching at a high level, people who are skilled in music, and they're being tutored by people in the community. So people from Black Bottom, people from Paradise Valley, these are black musicians who are saying, hey, you're pretty good with that horn. Let me show you. Come over to my house. And so you got these elder musicians who are mentoring these young students at the schools Northeastern High School, Detroit Commerce. Of course, Cass Tech always was a magnet school for high performers in academics, athletics, and in the arts. But even Miller, which is a black school in Black Bottom, has these high-level musicians who are performing in Black Bottom, who are performing in Paradise Valley. Even that school, Southeastern, Eastern High School, which would become Martin Luther King Jr. High School. You have all of these, Cody, Kettering. These schools have these music programs, and these teachers are highly skilled in music education, but also people in the community are taking these young people who show some skill and show some promise and taking them under their wing and teaching them too, because they come out of that era when jazz and blues was the thing.
So something that's just, I didn't prepare this question initially, but it's coming to mind as we talk, is you have a tour business in Detroit, and as the city is going through these changes and this comeback, who's coming on these tours?
Well, I would have to say it's, at this point, for the last almost 10 years now, it's been about 50-50. I would say about 50% of the people who take my tours are people from the city of Detroit. And about 50% of the people are from somewhere else. They're not from, they're visiting, or they're from a school, a university somewhere, and that school wants to learn, that class or that professor is bringing those students here to learn something about the city of Detroit. And so you got about 50% of people who are Detroiters, 50% of the people who are from somewhere else. They're not from the city of Detroit. And then on the same token, about 50% of the people who take tours with me are African American, and about 50% of the people who take tours with me are not African American. And I would argue that many of the African Americans who take my tours, they really fall into a couple of groups. And I would say I do public tours where people just buy a ticket and join. Many African Americans join those public tours, and church groups, family reunions, and social justice organizations. They also take my tours as well. And so African Americans, for the most part, fit into those categories. And when it comes to whites and others who are not African American who take my tours, some of them are university students, some of them are also in organizations, and some of them are schools. And so, and that's K through 12 for the most part, that they're the majority of the people who take my tours. A majority of people who are not African American who take my tours come from those groups. I would say that there's the major imbalance is gender. The overwhelming majority of people who take my tours are women. And there's an age imbalance as well. The majority of people who take my tours would be 50 and older. So more people who are older have seen so far the value in this history. So I'm trying to find different ways to reach out to young people. And women are more likely to take a tour. So generally when I get men on my tour, they're there with their wives, or they're there with their mom. Yeah. But women come without anybody. They'll come just them. And so it is a gender imbalance. If I do a bus tour and there's 55 people on that bus, and prior to COVID, I would do a lot of tours like that. It'd be 55 people on that bus. 40 of them at least are women. Okay. And so it is definitely a gender imbalance on my tours.
So what are some of, you made reference earlier to the Underground Railroad. What are some of the sites and locations around the city that relate to the Underground Railroad? Yeah,
so of course the most well-known site probably that relates to the Underground Railroad is the historic monument that sits down at the Detroit River. So it's called the Gateway to Freedom International Underground Railroad Memorial. And we're at the 20th anniversary of that monument. It was unveiled on October 20th, 2001. So 20 years ago, this month, not even a week ago, was when that monument was unveiled. It was done by Ed Dwight. Ed Dwight was he was the first African-American trained to be an astronaut with NASA. He's an Air Force test pilot, hand-chosen by President John F. Kennedy to be the first African-American to be an astronaut. But of course, if you've read the book or seen the film Hidden Figures, you know that NASA has some racial problems. Now, in the book and the film, those 3 black women fought through all of that. But Ed Dwight wasn't having it. He left. He realized that they were never going to let him be an astronaut. And so he left NASA and began sculpting. And so he sculpted a number of monuments. The monument down at the river, it's an international monument because their sister monument is across the river in Canada called the Tower of Freedom. He did both of those monuments, along with a number of other monuments throughout the country. And so that was unveiled in October 20th, 2001, and it highlights the story of Detroit's fight for freedom in this early period in 1800s where African Americans are leading the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. But of course also Second Baptist Church, the oldest black church in the state of Michigan, was a station on the Underground Railroad. It's been at the corner of Monroe and Beaubien since 1857. But the church was founded in 1836, so it was founded before Michigan was actually a state. So that was a station on the Underground Railroad. Two other churches that used to be in that same neighborhood, Bethel AME, St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, both of those churches were parts of the Underground Railroad. They're no longer in the area where they were when they were part of the Underground Railroad, but they're still in the city of Detroit. First Congregational Church, which is about a couple of blocks from where we are right now on Woodward and Forest. They weren't there back in the 1800s, but where they were in the 1800s, they were part of the Underground Railroad as well. So there's a number of other sites. Seymour Finney's Barn and Capitol Park, and a couple of other sites were part of Detroit's fight against slavery, which showed up most evidently in the Underground Railroad.
Okay. One last question about the tours. I found myself giving tours to out-of-towners that people are often surprised at the changes or disparities between neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. I would say, what neighborhoods do you think surprise people the most when you show them to them?
So probably both extremes. So there are neighborhoods, of course, in the city of Detroit on the east and west side that are really devastated. And they're very economically challenged. And we have, everyone knows we have streets where there may not be any more houses on that block, or maybe one house left on that block. And so people see that from other places, and they're shocked to see that Detroit, this city they've heard about, this city that put the world on wheels, the city where the auto factories were, they're shocked to see that there are areas where there are blocks where there's no house at all on one block, and then the next block may have one or two houses on that block. So they're shocked. But they're also shocked after seeing something like that, and then you're driving them to some area where on your part of your tour where there's Palmer Woods, or there's the Boston Edison, or there's Indian Village, or there's Sherwood Forest. And so seeing these stark contrasts in one city, for many people, they are shocked by that. In fact, there's people in the city of Detroit who don't know that there's this stark contrast. So I've taken people on who are from Detroit, and they go to other parts where they've never visited before, and they are shocked to see what exists. When you go to the Dr. Ocean Sweet House on the far east side, southeast side of the city of Detroit, Garland and Charlevoix, and you tell them the story about Dr. Ocean Sweet in 1925, and then you drive from there, and you're on your way to what used to be Black Bottom, so Lafayette Park. And you're driving from that neighborhood, that far east side, Mack and Bewick neighborhood, because that's where Dr. Sweet's house was, in the Mack and Bewick neighborhood. So you drive from that. So people in Detroit know Mack and Bewick. That is a marker in the city of Detroit. So you driving from that neighborhood, and people are seeing, and they're not from Detroit in most cases, and they're like, wow, they're shocked at what they're seeing. And then as you're driving through there, you have to drive through Indian Village. And so you pass, and they're like, what just happened? That's shocking. One block, you've seen one kind of look, and then in a block or two later, you see something that looks totally, doesn't even look like it's the same city. That's a shocking reality for many people.
Yeah, I found that as well. People often say, what? Hold on, what?
Right.
So what are some books that you would suggest for people to have in their library as good resources for Detroit's African-American history?
Yeah, so first, everyone should have, well, not everyone, but I would. Everybody. The Detroit Almanac by Bill McGraw and Peter Gavrilovich. It will be your reference book. You don't need to pick it up and read it from cover to cover. You need it as a reference so that when you're getting these other books and you're hearing these other things, you have somewhere to go to the index and say, well, let me find more about that particular thing. So it's your reference book. You keep it in the side like you keep your dictionary. So that's what that book is for. But then you're going to pick up Origins of the Urban Crisis by Thomas Sugru.
Yes.
You're going to pick up Black Detroit by Herb Boyd. You're going to pick $1 Million Worth of Nerve by King Coleman. And you're going to pick up A Fluid Frontier by Vita Tucker and Dr. Carolyn Smarts Frost. So these books cover different eras. The Fluid Frontier, that's the Underground Railroad period. And so you want to know that history. $1 Million Worth of Nerve, that's the Paradise Valley Black Bottom period. So you want to know something about that history. Origins of the Urban Crisis, that tells us about this racial inequality that's built into Detroit's political and economic system, really starting with the Great Migration. As more and more African Americans are coming to the city of Detroit, what happens? What's the response of the political establishment and the economic establishment in the state, in the city, to this, and the businesses? What happens because of that, which of course is a 50, 60-year head start on Detroit's bankruptcy. You get to the Detroit bankruptcy because of what's happening back in the 30s and 40s with federal, city, and state policy, which is largely in response to the African-American Great Migration from the South into the North, particularly into cities like the city of Detroit. So you get that part of the story. And then you have Black Detroit, which gives you a little introduction, a summary of all these different periods. It doesn't go into depth in any of these periods, but it gives you a little summary about all these periods, so you got a little bit of information about all of African-American Detroit history. So those are the recommendations. There's always more that I could give, but start with those.
Yeah, Origins of Crisis. I couldn't even finish it. It was just,
Yeah.
It was so mind-blowing.
It is.
And
It's very
every
powerful.
chapter, it just seemed to get worse and
It
worse
is powerful.
and
It is
worse.
powerful.
So switching up just a little bit, what does it mean to be an African-centered historian?
So an African-centered historian, so the idea of African-centered education and African-centered scholarship is the idea that when you're studying history, you're studying it from the aspect of not the white gaze, not what white people say about black people, but what black people have done, black people have contributed. So black people aren't objects in this history, they're subjects of this history. So they're actors. So they're not just being acted upon by others. So if you were just a random traditional American scholar about slavery, what you'd be studying is what white people did to black people. And I argue that's more white history than that is black history. That what white people did to black people during slavery is more about white history than black history. But if you're an African-centered scholar and you're talking about slavery, what you're talking about is, yes, of course you're going to talk about the fact of what whites did to black people, what they did to Africans, but you're really going to talk about Africans' response to what was happening to them. They're doing things. They're not just letting these things happen to them. They're doing all kinds of things. They're resisting. They're breaking the tools. They're burning the crops. They're refusing to work. They're leading slave uprisings. They're committing suicide in some cases, sometimes infanticide. They're killing their own children rather than have them go through slavery. They're resisting in all these different, they're putting glass in the food of the people that are enslaving them. These are all different ways they're trying to hold on to their African culture, even though they're being enslaved and they're being told you can't still practice that. You can't keep that African name. All the ways that they're responding and resisting slavery, that's what an African-centered scholar will be focusing on, not just talking about what white folks did to black people. Black people are important before white folks do anything to them. And black people have a history that precedes and transcends their relationship with white folks. But if you are a traditional American scholar about any subject, you're really talking about something becoming important when white folks see it. So America is discovered when white folks get here. So all that thousands of years of history that existed by the indigenous people before white folks showed up, that's unimportant because America don't become important until the real Americans showed up. And so most of your history and most historians focus on the white gaze. When white people show up to the place, when white people discover the thing, what did it become then? But an African-centered scholar will be focusing on a much more holistic look at that thing, particularly the actors, the agency of black people in the scenario. So that's, and of course they're looking at a lot of black scholarship around that area. And rather than looking only or merely to white scholars on that issue. So that would be what the difference is in the African-centered scholar.
So what's your take on all these school boards around the country and everyone going crazy about critical race theory and banning it?
Yeah. So number one, what they're calling critical race theory, there is a such thing as critical race theory.
Yeah.
But what they're calling critical race theory is
US
any
history.
teaching about the history of racism. That's really what it is. They do not want this history of racism to be taught. They don't want it to be taught that when this country was founded, that many of the founders were not only slave owners, they were enshrining the protection of slavery into the founding documents of this country. And preceding the United States as a country, the colonists, these British colonists in the 13 colonies, but French colonists in places like Detroit, and Spanish colonists in places like Florida and Texas and California and Mexico, and Dutch colonists in what was New Amsterdam, which of course would later become New York. They're doing the same thing there. They're enshrining white supremacy. They're enshrining an unequal system that whites will be at the top. Native Americans and Africans will be something else. They'll be deviant from the norm. That's what they're enshrining. And if you talk about that history, rather than just glorifying these so-called founders, then there's a battlefield that you have to weave through of people who saying, don't bring that up. We don't want you to talk about that. George Washington never told a lie. That's all we want you to say. Christopher Columbus discovered America. That's all that's important. The Pilgrims came and landed on Plymouth Rock, and that's all they want to just cover this glorification and heroification of these so-called founders of America. But they don't want to talk about these other parts. But history, if it doesn't at some point make people uncomfortable, then it ain't history. So you're just teaching folklore or legends or mythological facts. Or mythological stories, not facts, mythological stories. But history will, and sometimes create pride, and sometimes create a level of discomfort. If it never does either of the two, then you are not teaching history.
That's true, because I keep hearing, one of the things that gets me is when people talk about the Confederacy not fighting to maintain slavery, they were fighting for states' rights. And then you ask them, states' right to do what?
Right.
And they don't have a response to that.
Right,
one.
yeah. States' rights to have slavery. That's what it's for. That's what the states' rights is about.
So one of the things that came to mind as you talk about being an African-centered historian is one of the things is how do you explain the African oral tradition to people?
So it's not really all that difficult because most cultures have an oral tradition. We've been taught not to pay attention to it, to ignore it, but most cultures around the world, whether it's Asian, whether it's even European, whether it's African, whether it's indigenous people of the Americas, most of the groups of people start out oral culture before we have written culture. And of course, the African tradition of oral culture is a way that we have passed down much of our history. And it was passed down like that even though Africans are the founders of writing. So it is in ancient Egypt where Medu Neter, which we know by the Greek name hieroglyphics, that's where this writing idea starts. That we have the earliest writings from ancient Egypt, and which is an African nation. So even though that existed, it existed alongside this telling of stories, this handing it down. The French term is griot, but these other terms, jele, these African storytellers who would tell these stories and pass that history down to the next generation. And then when Africans were brought over into the Americas and enslaved, because they were prevented from reading and writing, they were forced to present their stories orally. And so they passed those histories down until some later generation will begin to write down those stories and chronicle this history that was being prevented from being lost due to the fact that Africans were prevented from practicing reading and writing. And so education itself, the passing along of stories, is a form of resistance to oppression.
So what role does storytelling have in the movement of the advancement of African Americans in the United States today?
To this day, it is a form of resistance to oppression. Passing this story down, education in any sense, but particularly the passing down of our history, the passing down of our family stories, the passing down of our neighborhood and community stories, that is a way of resisting oppression. It stops people from saying that you never can do anything. Yeah, y'all folks, and they of course come up with some insulting language instead of folks. I'm saying folks. But y'all folks ain't never done nothing. You never prospered. You never did this. Well, passing down these stories helps us to refute that fact or refute that argument, because we know that black people have created all kinds of successful communities all over the country despite Jim Crow, despite slavery. Of course you know the story of Tulsa, of Greenwood, Tulsa, which was known as Black Wall Street. And we know it gets destroyed in 1921 in a race massacre. But until about 6 or 7 years ago, this was not allowed to be taught in Tulsa schools. So you could grow up in Greenwood and never know what happened in your own neighborhood 100 years ago because it wasn't taught in school. You weren't never supposed to know that. You could grow up in the city of Detroit, like I did, and never have been told about Paradise Valley, and never knew that there was this black business district in the city of Detroit. You can grow up in North Carolina and never know about Durham, North Carolina, this black business district in Durham, North Carolina. You can grow up in Florida and never know about Rosewood. These places where black people have created these havens of economic and political success were systematically destroyed, but also the story about them was destroyed. So as bad as it is to destroy these actual places and kill many of the people who live there, that's horrible. But on top of that, the story about what happened there was forced to be destroyed. So people were never supposed to know this. So when historians and other people like me and others come along and tell these stories, this creates the idea that black people are able to do all these kinds of things. They've shown agency, they've resisted oppression, and not only have they done that, they haven't just survived, they thrived. They created high-level communities, high-performing communities on every level, whether it's economics, whether it's social organizing, whether it's helping the folks at the bottom. They've created these communities and been successful in creating these communities, but we've been disallowed from telling that story. Well, we're not disallowed anymore. We're telling those stories because there's an African proverb that states, until the lion has its own storytellers, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And you know how that go. If the hunter tells the story, he's gonna make it seem like, yeah, I took that lion down with my bare hands, I choked him out, and I'm just a strong hunter. But if the lion could tell the story, the lion would say, that's not what happened. He shot me when I wasn't looking in the back of the head. Had I saw him, I would have ate him. But he shot me, he snuck up on me with a gun and shot me. But had I saw him, I would have ate him. And that's what really happened. He didn't take me down with no bare hands. But now, lions have storytellers.
Yes, and we need them. So we're going to switch up just a little bit and talk a little bit more about you. You mentioned earlier you grew up in Detroit. What part of the city did you grow up in?
So I grew up in the northwest side of the city of Detroit, very close to Highland Park. In fact, I lived on the border of Detroit and Highland Park. My house was the Detroit house. Next door to me was a Highland Park house. So that's how close I was to Highland Park. And I attended both Detroit public schools and Highland Park public schools because I lived at that border. I lived northwest side of the city of Detroit, the border between Detroit and Highland Park.
Okay. What schools did you go to?
So in Detroit, I went to Halley, Post. Those are my Detroit schools. And in Highland Park, I graduated from Highland Park High School.
Okay.
So class of '89.
Okay. So you just started teaching at U of M this year. How's that been going?
So this has been a wonderful experience. As a leader of Black School Network History and Tours, I have worked with U of M for a long time. They've been one of the major schools that take my tours. So a lot of different colleges have taken tours with me, and I've partnered with some of the professors to do a class or two for them every year. But now, I teach my own class about Detroit history. And so it is giving these students a lens of learning about Detroit's history that many times you don't get. I'm hoping at some point that our students begin to get that before they get to college. So A lot of times our eyes are open once we get to college, but I'm hoping that we can open some eyes before college at some point. But yeah, this has been a great experience so far of teaching U of M students about Detroit's history, and they're learning about aspects of Detroit history that have never been taught K through 12.
Okay. So as we come out of the pandemic, we hope, and they just approved the vaccine for kids and things like that. What's next for you?
So of course, I was recently appointed the official Detroit city historian. 3 days ago, I became not just the historian for Black Squirrel Network History and Tourism, which I still am. I am the official historian for the city of Detroit. So thank you. As we're coming out of this pandemic, I'm hoping to begin to engage with neighborhoods, communities, and folks that have never taken my tours. But now with a larger platform, being the historian for the city of Detroit, I'll be able to meet with, talk to, work with, and teach about Detroit's history by working with neighborhoods, community organizations, and institutions that have yet to be really a part of the tours and lectures that I've been giving since 2013.
Okay. No, just curious. Did you know that the city of Detroit has the city that has submitted the most bids to host the Olympics without ever being awarded it?
I do know that, yes. Okay. So I do know that. In fact, I was on a panel a few months ago, and that was what the panel was about during the Olympics. So during the Olympics, there was a panel hosted by a number of scholars who were on that panel, and I was one of the people on that panel, and we were talking about the periods around each one of these applications for Detroit to host the Olympics. And we were talking about what was going on around each one of these times. And of course, I was focusing primarily on the African American history and what was going on in the African American community around these times. But yes, we talked about that. And of course, in the mid-30s, there's a time period when the Lions are champions, the Detroit Lions. I know it's hard to believe, but at one point, the Detroit Lions were champions. I know that you don't believe me, but you can check the historical records. They were champions. The Red Wings, the Tigers, and Joe Louis was the heavyweight champion of the world. So this is a time period when Detroit is the city of champions, and this is one of those time periods when Detroit is trying to get the Olympics. This is one of the periods that they're trying to get the Olympics. And yes, they were denied. And of course, part of it is due to an anti-Detroit attitude that has nothing to do with race, but there are people who are part of the Olympic organizing committee who are just opposed to Detroit getting it. And then of course, later, in some of those later years, it is partly about race. It is partly about what's going on in the city of Detroit regarding race. So all of these parts are parts of Detroit history that are very interesting and that people ought to want to learn about.
What I've always thought growing up was Chicago was our nemesis city, but learning some things, history, especially about the Olympics, but Los Angeles. Los Angeles is like, they got a vendetta against us when it comes to the Olympics and bidding on it. They're always undermining our bid. Right. Okay, we're now going to transition to what we call our lightning round. Okay. These are questions we ask all our guests each session. And first question is, what are you reading?
Right now, I am reading Grant by Ron Chernow, and it's about President Ulysses Grant. Of course, I've known and read about Grant before, but I'm trying to take a little deep dive into him because, of course, the Grant House was moved from the State Fair to the Eastern Market neighborhood, and I'm a part of a group of people that are a part of telling the story of this house and telling the story of Grant in its context with Detroit's history, with Black history, and with American history. So I'm taking a deep dive into the studying of Grant.
Okay. What are you listening to?
Oh, wow. Well, I listen to probably 1/3 of each. 1/3 I'm listening to a bunch of podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts, particularly about history. So I listen to a lot of history podcasts.
You got to add this to your list now.
Yeah, so this is on my playlist now.
Okay,
So this has been added. So,
right.
so that's 1/3 of what I listen to. The other third is gospel. So I listen to a lot of gospel, and then so we got 2/3 so far, and then that last third is everything: jazz, hip hop, neo soul, and I'd say that probably a little bit more beholden to 70s music. So if you're talking about Earth, Wind, and Fire, P-Funk, I'm more into that than probably the 90s and the 2000s music. But I listen to all of it, but I'm probably much closer to music from the 70s.
Okay. What do you like to eat? Where do you like to eat in the city, or what is your favorite restaurant?
Oh, wow. So I guess maybe my favorite restaurant is Urban Soul. And maybe it's a toss-up between Urban Soul and Burt's. So I like them both. Savannah Blue is another I like. So I got maybe more than one favorite restaurant. Savannah Blue, Burt's, and Urban Soul. Most of course, all three of them, much of what they serve will be considered soul food. They're different levels. So Urban Soul right now is mainly takeout because of COVID.
Yeah.
And Burt's has they are my favorite chicken. My favorite fried chicken in Detroit is at Burt's. However, you cannot be in a hurry if you're at Burt's. All right, so just know that if you're about to order something from Burt's, you're not about to leave no time soon. And Savannah Blue, I would call the upscale. That would be the upscale soul food place. So it's going to have a little flair and a little more twist to it, and a little bit more cost to it as well.
Okay. So this, usually, mostly pre-COVID, but even now, where do you socialize in the city?
I guess much of my social activity has been really cut way down,
Yeah.
in person, that is. I do a lot of socializing on social media, on the phone, Zoom, but very little of that actual socializing in person. However, because I still do lead tours, people beat me on my tours. So a lot of it happens in downtown Detroit.
Okay. And what is something someone visiting the city have to do when they get here?
So one thing you have to do when you get here, but you can't do it, sadly, you can't do it now, and that is visit the Motown Museum. Right now, the Motown Museum is going through an upgrade, a $55 million upgrade, and so they're not open to the public right now. But when they are, that's something you have to do. You have to see Motown, how it looked and how it was when it was Motown. Now, after they do the $55 million upgrade, it's possible that we might lose some of that, how it was when Berry Gordy was here from 1959 to 1972, pumping out records by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, the Temptations, the Supremes, the Four Tops, the Marvelettes, Martha and the Vandellas, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, the Jackson 5, the Commodores. We might lose some of that when it becomes a $55 million museum. But if they retain, and I hope they do, and I really pray that they do, if they retain some of that basic level of recording, when you go into Studio A and see where those people stand, where they used to stand, when the Temptations did the Temptations walk, you standing right there, you can see exactly where the Funk Brothers were playing at. You can see right at the vending machine that Stevie Wonder used to get his candy bar from. If you can see that, it has an effect on you that you take with you no matter where else you go.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm excited about that renovation. Can't wait till that's done. And the last question is, where can we find you?
So you can find me, of course. The easiest way to find me is to Google Black Scroll Detroit. You Google that and you'll see all of my things. You'll see my website. You'll find out where my email is. You'll find my Facebook page, Black Scroll Network History and Tours. You'll see my Instagram. You'll see some clips of videos of me. If you and they'll be on YouTube. You'll be able to see some of the stuff that I do. So that's the easiest way to find me. But I do have a website, blackscrollnetwork.com. blackscrollnetwork.weebly, WEEBLY.com. blackscrollnetwork.weebly.com.
Okay. Well, actually, any last thoughts, comments for our guests? For our audience?
The only thing that I want to leave you with is that Black history, and especially Detroit's African American history, is one history. It is all connected to everything else. And of course, outside of that, Black history is history. It's not just Black history. But in as much as we view it, because it's been missing from our textbooks, it's been missing from our curriculum, so we have this thing that we call Black history, and we have this thing called Detroit's Black history. It is all connected. You can draw a line from slavery and the Underground Railroad to Black Bottom and Paradise Valley. And you can draw a line from Black Bottom and Paradise Valley to Aretha Franklin and Motown. And you can draw a line from Aretha Franklin and Motown to the election of Coleman Young and techno music. All of these things are part of one long story, and the lines that connect all of them are there once you know this history.
All right. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Jamon Jordan, thank you for joining us today.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the DDP. This is a production of the University of Michigan Detroit Center. You can find us anywhere you get your pods. Please rate, review, and subscribe. This podcast is directed and produced by Marlon Franklin, edited by Mackenzie Hewitt, writing contributions by James Neely and Florence Alexander.